The wagon wheel dropped into a rut on the trail, and something shifted in the cargo bed that did not belong there. It was not the sound of grain sacks settling. It was not the creak of wooden crates finding new positions against each other. It was something else entirely. Something that made Caleb Whitmore pull the reins and bring his two draft horses to a slow halt on the moonlit trail, somewhere between Hillsborough and the high country of northern New Mexico. The year was 1882, and the July night hung over the desert like a wool blanket soaked in heat. During the day, the sun had hammered the red earth until the air itself seemed to ripple and bend. But now, past midnight, the temperature had dropped the way it always did in this territory, sharp and sudden, and Caleb could see his breath in thin silver wisps as he sat motionless on the driver's seat, listening. Behind him, Jesse brought his horse alongside the second wagon and stopped. He did not ask why they were stopping. He simply drew his revolver from the worn leather holster on his right hip and held it pointed at the sky, his thumb resting on the hammer. That was Jesse. He did not need to know the reason for trouble before he was ready for it. Trouble was reason enough. Silas, driving the third wagon 20 yards back, clicked his tongue and eased his team to a halt. He reached under the seat and came up with a lantern, striking a match against his boot heel with practiced ease. The flame caught and threw a small circle of warm orange light across his face, revealing the youngest Whitmore brother squinting into the darkness, with an expression that was half curiosity and half concern. The three of them had been on the road since late afternoon, hauling supplies from Hillsborough back to the Double W Ranch, 15 miles north. It was a routine trip they made every few months, loading up on flour, sugar, ammunition, lumber, nails, and all the other things a working cattle ranch consumed the way fire consumed dry wood. They had planned to make the drive in daylight, but a broken axle on Silas's wagon had cost them 4 hours of repairs outside the general store, and by the time everything was loaded and secured, the sun was already dropping behind the western mesas like a coin falling into a slot. Caleb had decided to drive through the night rather than pay for rooms at the boarding house. It was a decision born of practicality, not stubbornness, though his brothers might have argued the point. The ranch needed these supplies. The cattle needed feeding. And Caleb Whitmore had never been the kind of man who let a little darkness slow him down. He was 27 years old, the eldest of three brothers, and he had been running the Double W since their father James died of fever 6 years ago. Their mother Eleanor had followed James into the ground barely a year later, not from any illness anyone could name, but from something deeper, something that lived in the hollow space a good marriage leaves behind when one half of it is torn away. She simply lost the will to keep fighting. And one December morning, Caleb had found her still and cold in the bed she had shared with his father for 23 years, her face peaceful in a way it had not been since the funeral. That was the winter Caleb became something more than a young rancher. He became the foundation on which everything else rested. Jesse was 20, wild and angry, and looking for someone to hit. Silas was 19, quiet and shaken, and trying to understand how a world with their mother in it could become a world without her, between one heartbeat and the next. And Caleb, barely into manhood himself, had stood on the porch of the adobe house their father had built and made himself a promise that he would hold his family together or die in the attempt. 6 years later, that promise had calcified into something permanent, something woven into the architecture of his bones. He was tall, 6.5 feet of lean, hard muscle built by years of fence mending and cattle driving and the 1,000 daily labors of keeping a ranch alive in territory that wanted to kill everything in it. His face was all sharp angles, a strong square jaw with perpetual stubble, high cheekbones that caught shadows, and eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight. A scar ran along his left jaw where a wild horse had thrown him into a fence post when he was 17. His hair was chestnut brown, medium length, and permanently sun-streaked from a life lived almost entirely outdoors. He spoke less than either of his brothers, but when he did speak, people listened because Caleb Whitmore never wasted a word. Now he sat perfectly still on the wagon seat, his head tilted slightly to the right, waiting. The sound came again. A breath. Not the shallow mechanical breathing of sleep, but the tight, controlled breathing of someone who was trying very hard not to be heard and whose exhausted body was refusing to cooperate. Each inhale had a faint tremor in it, the kind that comes from muscles pushed past their limit, from lungs that want to gasp but are being forced to sip air in tiny, careful portions. Caleb climbed down from the seat without hurry. He moved the way he always moved, deliberate and economical, each action serving a purpose. His boots hit the hard-packed earth, and he walked around to the back of the wagon, his eyes adjusting to the silver wash of half-moon light that painted everything in shades of gray and blue. Jesse appeared at his right side. The revolver was still out, held low against his thigh. Jesse was 26, 1 year younger than Caleb, and built like something designed for violence. He was the same towering height as his older brother, but slightly wider through the shoulders, with a thick, muscular frame that looked like it had been assembled from cables and slabs of granite. His hair was darker than Caleb's, closer to deep brown, and his eyes the same warm amber as his brother's carried a sharper edge, a constant intensity that made strangers uncomfortable and made enemies reconsider. He had a scar where a bullet had grazed his left shoulder 2 years ago during a cattle rustling incident, and his knuckles were permanently marked from fights he had won and a few he had not. Jesse Whitmore did not start trouble, but he finished it with a thoroughness that people in Hillsborough still talked about. Silas came up on the left lantern, in one hand, his other hand empty and open. He was 25, the youngest, and while he matched his brothers in height, he was leaner, built more for speed than force. His hair was lighter, a warm brown that curled slightly at the ends, and his features were softer than the other two, closer to their mothers. He was the one who had inherited Eleanor's love of books, her facility with language, her ability to read a room and know exactly what needed to be said and when. He was also the worst cook in the territory, a fact that had become something of a running tragedy in the Whitmore household. The three brothers surrounded the back of Caleb's wagon in a formation that was as natural to them as breathing. Caleb at center, Jesse on the right closest to his gun hand, Silas on the left closest to the escape route and the light source. They had stood this way 100 times before facing down rustlers, predators, strangers on the road. Their bodies knew the positions before their minds gave the order. Caleb reached for the canvas tarp that covered the cargo bed. He gripped the edge and pulled it back in one smooth motion. What he saw made him go very still. Curled between two 50-pound sacks of flour and a wooden crate of horseshoe nails, a young woman lay on her side with her knees drawn up to her chest and her arms wrapped around herself. She was Apache. That was the first thing Caleb registered, even in the dim light of Silas's lantern. Her skin was deep brown with warm bronze undertones that spoke of a lifetime under the desert sun. Her hair was jet black and impossibly long, falling well past her shoulders in thick strands that were tangled and matted with dust and sweat, and woven through with small feathers and thin leather strips bearing tiny turquoise beads. Her face was strong and oval, with high sculpted cheekbones and a straight nose and full lips that were cracked from dehydration. She wore a deerskin dress and faded buckskin tan, the kind of traditional Apache garment that Caleb had seen on the reservation women who sometimes traded goods in Hillsborough. But this dress was torn, badly torn. The neckline was ripped open along one side, and the fabric at the waist was split as if someone had grabbed it and yanked. There was beadwork along the yoke, turquoise and red ochre and bone white, but some of the beads were missing, scattered somewhere along whatever desperate path had brought this woman to his wagon. She wore moccasin boots that reached her calves, and they were worn almost through at the soles. But it was the injuries that hit Caleb like a physical blow. Both her wrists bore deep, angry marks where rope had been tied and had bitten into skin. The marks were red and raw, some scabbed over, others still oozing. Dark bruises bloomed across her shoulders and upper arms, visible through the tears in her dress. There was a healing cut on her outer thigh where the deerskin had split. Her forearms were covered in scratches, the kind made by running through thorny brush without caring about the damage. She had been through something terrible. The evidence was written across every inch of her body. And her eyes. Her eyes were open, and they were looking directly at him. They were dark brown, so dark they were nearly black, and they burned with an intensity that made Caleb's chest tighten. There was fear in those eyes, absolutely, and exhaustion so deep it looked bottomless. But underneath all of that, burning like coals under ash, was defiance. Pure, unbroken, ferocious defiance. This was not the look of a victim. This was the look of someone who had walked through hell and refused, absolutely refused, to let it destroy her. Jesse's gun came up instinctively, not aimed at her, but raised ready. His body read threat before his mind could sort the details. Silas lowered the lantern so its light would not blind her, and he spoke in a voice he usually reserved for calming, spooked horses, low and even, and devoid of any sharpness. He tried Spanish first. Está bien, nadie va a hacerte daño. Then English, just as gentle. It is okay. Nobody here is going to hurt you. Caleb looked at the rope burns on her wrists. He looked at the bruises on her shoulders. He looked at the way she had pressed herself against the wall of the wagon like an animal preparing for its last stand, ready to fight, even though it was obvious she had nothing left to fight with. Her body was trembling with exhaustion, but her chin was lifted and her jaw was set and her gaze never left his face. She was measuring him, deciding if he was dangerous, calculating whether she could survive whatever came next. And Caleb smiled. It was not a grin, it was not pity, it was not mockery. It was a quiet, calm expression that softened the hard lines of his face and said without words that whatever she was expecting from this moment, it was not what she was going to get. It was the smile of a man who had just recognized something in front of him that he could not turn away from, something that called to the promise he had made on that cold porch 6 years ago, the promise to hold things together. "Well now," Caleb said, and his voice was low and steady despite the storm building in his chest. "Guess you are coming home with us." The woman did not move. She did not relax. But something in her expression shifted, just barely a tiny crack in the wall of fear. She had been ready for anger. She had been ready for violence. She had been ready for rough hands and shouted orders and all the things that men had done to her over the past 6 months. She had not been ready for a smile. Caleb extended his hand to help her out of the wagon. She looked at his hand for a long moment, studying it the way a person studies a snake to determine if it is venomous. Then she pulled herself up without taking it, climbing over the sacks of flour with movements that were stiff and painful but deliberate. She would not accept help. Not yet. Not until she knew what it would cost. But when her feet hit the ground, her legs buckled. 6 months of captivity, followed by 3 days of running through open desert without food or water, had drained her body beyond what willpower alone could sustain. She stumbled forward, and Caleb caught her, one hand on her elbow, steady and firm, but not gripping, not holding, just supporting. The instant she found her balance, he let go. He stepped back. He gave her space. It was such a small thing. Letting go, stepping back. But Kaya noticed it. She noticed it the way a person who has been burned notices the temperature of every surface they touch. This man had caught her and released her in the same breath. He had not held on. He had not used the moment of her weakness to establish control. He had simply kept her from falling and then returned her to herself. She straightened her spine, drew her shoulders back, lifted her chin, and even standing there in a torn dress covered in dust and blood, trembling with exhaustion, she looked like a queen. "My name is Kaya," she said. Her English was clear, carrying the distinctive rhythm of someone who had learned the language as a second tongue. Each word was precise, chosen carefully, nothing wasted. "I am sorry for hiding in your wagon. I did not know what else to do." Then she added 3 words that changed the air around them, the way a match changes the air in a room full of gunpowder. "They will come." Caleb did not ask who. Not yet. He looked at Jesse, who was reading the same signs Caleb was reading, the rope burns, the bruises, the torn dress, the 3 days of desert, written in the cracks of her lips and the hollows under her eyes. Jesse holstered his revolver with a sharp, decisive motion that said his assessment of the threat had shifted from the woman in front of them to whoever had put those marks on her. Silas was already moving. He grabbed a water skin from his wagon and a package of dried beef and brought them over, holding them out to Kaya the way you would offer food to a wild hawk that had landed unexpectedly on your fence post, carefully, without sudden movements, without demands. "Here," he said. "Eat, drink, everything else can wait." Kaya took the water and drank deeply, and Caleb saw her hands shaking as she held the skin to her cracked lips. She ate some of the dried beef in small, measured bites, and some color began to return to her face. Then Caleb gestured to the seat beside him on the wagon. "Sit up front. It is a long way still." He paused, then added quietly, "You are safe now." Kaya climbed up onto the wagon seat. She sat rigid and upright, her eyes scanning the road behind them toward Hillsborough, toward whatever she had fled. Caleb took up the reins and signaled the horses forward. Jesse fell into position alongside on horseback, his hand no longer near his gun, but his eyes sweeping the darkness in every direction with the automatic vigilance of a man who had been guarding his family since the day he was old enough to hold a weapon. Silas followed with the third wagon, and somewhere in the first mile, he began to whistle softly, a low, tuneless sound that was his way of processing tension, of telling the night that the Whitmore brothers were on this road, and the road had better behave itself. They rode in silence for nearly an hour. Caleb did not push. He kept his eyes on the trail, gave Kaya room to breathe, and waited. He had learned a long time ago that people who had been through the worst things needed silence more than they needed questions. When she finally spoke again, it was with the flat, steady tone of someone delivering a report rather than telling a story. She did not dramatize. She did not embellish. She laid down facts the way a stonemason lays bricks one on top of another, building something terrible and solid. 6 months ago, a group of armed men led by a trader named Randolph Garrett had attacked the small settlement where her family lived. It was not a war camp. It was a cluster of families that had separated from the larger Apache bands to live peacefully near the edges of white territory. Her father, a warrior named Nantan, had believed it was possible for his people to exist alongside the newcomers if they chose their ground carefully and kept to themselves. He had been wrong. Garrett and his men had come at dawn. They had killed the men who fought back. Kaya's birth father had been among those killed, shot through the chest as he tried to give the women time to run. Her mother had died in the same attack. Kaya had been captured along with 2 other young women. Garrett had transported them south to Santa Fe and sold them to men who had the money to buy human beings and the power to make sure nobody asked questions. Kaya had been sold to a man named Gerald Thornton. He was 48 years old, the owner of a silver mine outside Santa Fe, and he was rich in the way that insulates a man from consequences. He had purchased 2 Apache women before Kaya. Both had died within a year, one from what was officially called a fever, the other from what was officially called an accident. Kaya had seen the scars on the walls of the room where they had kept her, and she knew what those women had actually died from. She had escaped 3 days ago. She did not explain how, and Caleb did not ask. The rope burns on her wrists and the cut on her thigh and the bruises on her shoulders told enough of that story. She had run north through open desert with no water, no food, no weapon, and no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and the men who believed they owned her. When she reached Hillsboro half dead from dehydration and sunstroke, she had seen 3 wagons parked outside the general store. She had crawled into the first one and hidden beneath the tarp and waited to see where fate would carry her. When she finished speaking, the silence that followed was enormous. Jesse was the first to break it. He pulled his horse up alongside the wagon, his face a mask of controlled fury, the muscles in his jaw working as if he were physically chewing on his rage. "The full name," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Garrett, Thornton, I want their full names." Silas from the wagon behind called forward. "She needs rest, real rest, and food, and medical attention for those wrists. We can figure out the rest when we get home." Practical, compassionate, taking care of what was in front of him before worrying about what was behind them. Caleb looked at Kaya. She was watching him with those dark, burning eyes, waiting for his verdict, waiting to find out if his smile on the trail had been real or just a reflex. "You stay with us," Caleb said. His voice held no flourish, no grand declaration. It was the voice of a man stating something that was already true. "Work for your keep if you want. Stay as long as you need." Then he turned to Jesse. "Nobody rides off looking for trouble tonight. We go home first. We plan tomorrow." Jesse wanted to argue. Caleb could see it in the tension across his brother's shoulders. But Jesse looked into Caleb's eyes and saw the order there immovable and absolute. And he swallowed his protest and nodded once. The double W appeared in the pale light of early dawn. The adobe house sat long and low against the landscape, its covered porch wrapping around 3 sides like arms extended in welcome. The barn was large and solid, the corrals well-maintained, and off in the distance, the small cabin where old Miguel lived with his wife Rosa and their son Carlos was just visible as a dark shape against the brightening eastern sky. Everything about the ranch spoke of care and persistence. Every fence line was straight. Every hinge was oiled. Flower pots sat on the porch railing, planted by Eleanor Whitmore years ago, and tended since then by 3 men who did not know much about flowers, but knew that their mother had loved them, and that was reason enough to keep them growing. Old Miguel came out to meet them. He was close to 50, stocky and strong, with silver threading through his black hair and a face that had been carved by decades of desert wind and hard work. He had been with the Whitmore family since before Caleb was born, hired by James Whitmore as a young man, and elevated over the years from ranch hand to foreman to something closer to family. He did not startle easily. But when he saw the young Apache woman climbing down from Caleb's wagon in the gray dawn light, his weathered face went very still. He looked at Kaya. He looked at Caleb. He understood immediately. "I will tell Rosa to prepare a room. he said simply. Then he pulled Caleb aside, speaking low. You know what this will lead to. Caleb met his eyes. I know, but I cannot walk away from this. You know I cannot. Miguel exhaled slowly. Your mother would have said the same thing. A pause. All right, but we need to prepare. Rosa came up to the house 20 minutes later, a sturdy woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and capable hands. She was cautious around Kaya, at first uncertainty flickering across her face, but she led the girl upstairs to the small room that had once been Eleanor's sewing room without hesitation. Kaya stood in the doorway for a long time, not entering. Rosa waited patiently. Then Kaya asked a question that hit Rosa like a stone thrown at her heart. Does the door lock from the inside? Rosa understood instantly what that question meant. This girl had been locked in rooms before, locked in from the outside with no control over who entered or when or what they wanted. Yes, child, Rosa said, and her voice was thick. It locks from the inside, and there is only one key. You keep it. Kaya stepped inside. She turned the key in the lock, and for the first time in 6 months, she slept without fear that someone would open the door in the darkness. The first 3 days, Kaya barely left her room except for meals. She ate quickly, sparingly, her eyes always tracking toward the door as if calculating escape routes. The 3 brothers gave her space. Caleb had instructed Jesse and Silas that no one was to knock on her door unless the house was on fire, and even then they should probably shout from the hallway first. It was the 4th morning that changed things. Silas was at the stove waging his daily war against breakfast. The eggs were blackened on one side and raw on the other. The biscuits had achieved a density that it suggested they could be used as building materials. The coffee was so strong that the spoon appeared to be standing upright in the cup through sheer force of concentration. Jesse sat at the table, eating everything without expression, because Jesse ate what was put in front of him the same way he accepted bad weather as something to be endured without complaint. Caleb drank his coffee and said nothing because he had given up on Silas's cooking the way a man gives up on trying to teach a cat to fetch. It was simply not going to happen, and accepting that fact was the first step toward peace. Kaya appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She stood in the kitchen doorway watching Silas battle the skillet, and something in her expression shifted. It was not quite a smile. It was closer to the expression a person might wear while watching someone try to put out a fire by fanning it with a blanket. She walked to the stove. Without a word, she reached out and took the spatula from Silas's hand. He released it immediately, no resistance, no protest, just a look of profound relief. In 20 minutes, she transformed the wreckage of breakfast into something remarkable. Eggs cooked with wild herbs she had spotted growing in Eleanor's neglected garden. Biscuits that were golden and soft and steaming. Venison from the pantry sliced thin and fried with root vegetables. The 3 brothers ate in a silence that had shifted from resigned to astonished. When the last plate was clean, Silas set down his fork with ceremonial gravity and announced, I am officially retired from cooking. Permanently. Jesse looked at Kaya across the table. He gave her a single short nod. From Jesse Whitmore, that nod carried the weight of a 10-minute speech from anyone else. Over the following days, she took command of the household with quiet efficiency. She cooked meals that made even Miguel admit she might be better at the stove than his Rosa. She laundered the brothers' worn work clothes and mended them with stitching so fine and strong that Jesse, who had been tying his shirts together with rawhide strips 4 months, examined the repairs with genuine surprise. She weeded Eleanor's flower beds and coaxed the struggling vegetable garden back to life with techniques that seemed to involve talking to the plants in Apache, which Silas found fascinating and Jesse found suspicious. But it was outside the house that Kaya truly proved herself. 1 week after her arrival, she followed Caleb out to the south pasture where he was checking the cattle. She pointed at a cow that had drifted to the edge of the herd. That one is sick, she said. Look at how she walks. Her back legs are weak and her head is dropping. If you do not separate her, the sickness will spread. Caleb called Miguel over to check, and the old rancher confirmed it within minutes. The cow was running a high fever. They pulled her from the herd in time. Caleb asked Kaya how she had known. She said, I grew up among horses. Sick animals move differently. They breathe differently. Anyone can see it if they know how to look. After that, Caleb began consulting Kaya on the cattle, on water sources, on the weather patterns that govern life and death in this unforgiving landscape. And every time her assessment proved accurate. Jesse came around more slowly. He was not hostile to Kaya, but he was uncomfortable with a woman in the house in a way that had nothing to do with prejudice and everything to do with the fact that he had not lived with a woman since his mother died. Then she fixed his saddle. The leather strap that held the cinch had been broken for weeks, and Jesse had been tying it together with a temporary knot that slipped at least twice a day. Kaya noticed took the saddle while Jesse was out checking fence and repaired it using an Apache leather working technique that produced a bond stronger than anything the saddlery in Hillsborough could have managed. When Jesse found his saddle, tested the repair, and realized it was not going to slip, he looked at Kaya with new eyes. He did not say thank you, but he stopped avoiding the kitchen. Silas was the easiest of the three. He taught her to ride Western style, and the first lesson ended with both of them on the ground after the horse decided to turn around without consulting its passengers. Silas lay in the dust, laughing so hard he could not breathe, and Kaya, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, laughed with him. It was a real laugh, clear and sudden, and it carried across the yard to where Caleb and Jesse were working near the barn. Both brothers turned to look. Jesse asked quietly, "When was the last time anyone laughed in this house?" Caleb did not answer, but he watched Kaya laughing in the sunlight, and something inside his chest that had been frozen since the day his mother died began slowly and painfully to thaw. Late at night, when the house was dark and everyone was asleep, Kaya sat by the window in her room. She held the small bone pendant that hung from a leather cord around her neck. It was carved in the shape of a running horse, smooth from years of handling, and it was the only thing she had left from her birth father. She whispered in Apache, her voice barely audible, the words flowing in a rhythmic pattern that could have been a prayer or a promise or an oath. The moonlight fell across her face, and in that silver light, she was neither the frightened girl who had hidden in a wagon, nor the capable woman who ran the kitchen during the day. She was something else, something older, something that carried a weight not yet revealed. 2 weeks after Kaya arrived at the Double W, the sign came. Caleb was repairing fence in the south pasture, and Kaya was beside him carrying tools and handing him wire when he needed it. Then Caleb stopped. His eyes narrowed against the afternoon glare fixed on the southern horizon. 3 thin columns of smoke were rising against the pale sky, not the thick, billowing smoke of a grass fire. These were controlled, deliberate, spaced evenly apart. Signal smoke. Chaos saw them at the same instant, and her reaction was immediate and violent. She dropped the tools. The blood drained from her face so fast that Caleb thought she might faint. Her hands, which had been steady all morning, began to tremble. "That is not Apache smoke," she said, and her voice was stretched tight as wire. "That is a tracking signal Garrett uses Apache scouts, men he buys with whiskey and guns to hunt their own people." She turned to Caleb. "He knows I am in this area. He is coming." Caleb looked at the smoke. He looked at Kaya. Then he said with the calm that was his shield against everything the world threw at him, "Back to the house. Get everyone together. We need to talk." That evening, 6 people sat around the big kitchen table. Caleb at the head, Jesse to his right, jaw-tight fingers drumming on the table. Silas to Caleb's left, unusually quiet, turning a pencil between his fingers. Miguel across from Caleb, his weathered face grave. Carlos beside his father, young and nervous, but steady. And Kaya at the far end of the table, sitting upright, with her hands flat on the wood as if she were holding herself to the earth. A rough map of the ranch and surrounding territory was spread between them. Caleb laid out the situation in plain terms. Garrett had money men and legal connections. The ranch had defensible terrain, but could not hold out against a prolonged siege. They needed a plan that used their strengths and avoided a direct confrontation they could not win. Jesse spoke first. "Set an ambush at the South Pass. When they come through, we hit them before they know what is happening." Silas shook his head. "We ambush a licensed trader with legal documents, and we hang for murder. We need evidence. We need the law on our side, not his." Miguel said, "Your father served with Governor Sheldon during the war. A letter to Santa Fe might carry some weight." Caleb listened to all of it. Then he turned to Kaya. "I need you to tell me everything about Garrett, every detail. How he operates, who his men are, where his weaknesses lie." Kaya looked at him, and something changed in her expression. It was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was respect. Because he had not asked, "How do I protect you?" He had asked, "What do you know so that we can fight together?" That night, after the others had gone to bed, Caleb and Kaya sat on the porch. The sky above them was impossibly vast, thick with stars that blazed in the clean desert air, the Milky Way streaming overhead like a river of light. "There is something I have not told you," Kaya said. Her voice was low, almost lost in the sound of wind moving across the open land. My foster father, Nantan, he did not die in the attack. He was badly wounded, but he survived. He has been gathering the survivors, rebuilding, and he has been searching for me. She paused. The pendant in her hand caught a sliver of starlight. If he finds me here at the ranch of white men, he will not see the difference between you and Garrett. To Nantan, all white men are the enemy. He will burn this place and kill everyone in it. The silence that followed was so complete that Caleb could hear the cattle lowing in the far pasture a mile away. So we are caught between two sides, Caleb said. Garrett from the south, Nantan from the north. Yes, Kaya said, and I am the reason for both. If I leave, both sides will follow me instead of coming here. Caleb turned to look at her. The starlight caught in his gaze and made something in it glow. You are not going anywhere, he said, and his voice came out deeper than he intended. This is your home now. We will find a way. Kaya studied his face for a long time. Why, she asked. Why are you doing this? You owe me nothing. Caleb was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words, because Caleb always searched for the right words rather than reaching for the easy ones. Then he said, my mother told me something before she died. She said to always stand up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. I have not kept that promise enough times in my life. This time I will. Kaya held his gaze, and something passed between them in the darkness, something that was not spoken and did not need to be something that both of them recognized and neither was ready to name. Later, after Kaya had gone upstairs, Caleb stood alone on the porch, his hands gripping the railing. Jesse appeared beside him, moving quiet the way he always did despite his size. The two brothers stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the vast, dark emptiness of the desert. You are falling in love with her, Jesse said. It was not a question. It was a statement delivered the way Jesse delivered everything, bluntly, without apology, aimed directly at the center of the target. Caleb did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He said, that does not matter right now. What matters is keeping her alive. Jesse nodded. Fine, then we keep her alive. He put his hand on Caleb's shoulder and gripped it once hard, the way he had been gripping his brother's shoulder since they were boys, and the world felt too big and too dangerous for anyone to face alone. All three of us, same as always. Silas materialized in the doorway. He was holding 3 glasses of whiskey. I heard everything, he said. Nobody needs to perform. Drink, sleep, and we figure out the rest tomorrow. He handed each brother a glass. The 3 Whitmore men stood on the porch of the house their father had built, drinking in silence, looking at the darkness. Behind them, the warm glow of lamplight fell through the windows of a home that was not empty anymore. Above them, the same stars that Kaya's people and Caleb's people had both watched for centuries turned slowly across the sky, telling stories in languages that were different and equally true. And upstairs, behind a locked door, whose only key she held, a young Apache woman slept deeply and peacefully for the first time in 6 months, because 3 strangers had found her in a wagon and decided that she mattered. Somewhere out there in the dark, from 2 different directions, trouble was riding toward them. But tonight on this porch, in this moment, the Whitmore brothers were together, and they were ready, and that was enough. 3 weeks after the night, Caleb Whitmore pulled back a canvas tarp and found a woman with fire in her eyes hiding among his flour sacks. The first storm arrived on horseback at midday. The heat that afternoon was the kind that made the air visible, shimmering above the red earth in waves that bent the horizon into something liquid and uncertain. Caleb was inside the house reviewing supply ledgers at the kitchen table when Carlos came running from the barn, his boots pounding the hard-packed ground, his young face tight with alarm. Riders coming from the south, boss, 4 of them. Caleb closed the ledger. He stood up, reached for his hat, hanging on the peg by the door, and put it on with the deliberate care of a man who understood that the next few minutes might determine the course of everything that followed. He stepped onto the porch and saw them. 4 figures on horseback moving at an easy pace that suggested confidence rather than haste. The man in front rode like someone who spent most of his life in carriages and offices rather than saddles, stiff and slightly off balance, but dressed in a black vest and a flat-brimmed hat that looked expensive even from a distance. Behind him rode 3 men who sat their horses with the loose predatory ease of men who were paid to be good at violence. Jesse was already outside. He had seen the riders before Carlos did, because Jesse always saw trouble before anyone else, the way a wolf smells smoke on the wind long before the fire is visible. He was leaning against the fence post near the horse corral, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his hat pulled low, tracking the approaching riders with an intensity that made the air around him feel charged. Silas appeared from the back of the house, wiping his hands on a kitchen cloth. He took one look at the riders, dropped the cloth on the porch railing, and positioned himself on the left side of the front steps, leaning against the support column, with a posture that looked casual to anyone who did not know him. The brothers took their positions without a word, the formation so practiced it required no thought. Caleb at the center, his brothers flanking like pillars of the same gate. Inside the house, Kaya stood behind the kitchen window, watching through the narrow gap between the curtain and the frame. Rosa was beside her, one hand gripping Kaya's arm in silent solidarity, the other hand behind her back, where she held the largest knife from the kitchen block. Rosa had not survived 50 years in this territory by being unprepared. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop at the foot of the porch steps. He dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested the indignity of horseback travel. Up close, Randolph Garrett was exactly the kind of man that Caleb's mother had warned her sons about. He was in his mid-50s, well-fed, well-groomed, with graying hair combed neatly back from a high forehead and a mustache that was trimmed with the precision of someone who spent time in front of mirrors. His clothes were expensive, his boots were polished, his hands were soft and pale, the hands of a man who had other people do his labor for him. And he smiled constantly, a practiced expression that curved his lips without ever reaching his eyes. It was the pleasantness that made him dangerous. A man who shouted threats could be dismissed. A man who smiled while he destroyed you was something else entirely. "The Whitmore brothers," Garrett said, and his voice carried the smooth, modulated tone of someone accustomed to speaking in rooms where people had no choice but to listen. "I am Randolph Garrett, a trader based in Santa Fe. I hope you gentlemen can help me with a small matter. I am looking for an Apache servant girl who ran away from her lawful employment 6 months ago. I have reliable information that she was seen climbing into a wagon outside the Hillsboro General Store 3 weeks past." He paused, letting the smile do its work. "Your wagon specifically, Mr. Whitmore." Caleb looked at Garrett the way he might look at a rattlesnake coiled on his porch, with calm assessment rather than fear. "There is no Apache girl here, Mr. Garrett." Garrett tilted his head slightly. "Mr. Whitmore, I have sources I trust. I simply wish to reclaim what is lawfully mine. I have a labor contract properly executed and filed with the court in Santa Fe. This is a matter of property and contract law, nothing more complicated than recovering a stray horse." Jesse pushed away from the fence post. He took one step forward, just one, but the movement of a man his size closing distance had an effect on the 3 hired guns behind Garrett that was immediate and visible. All 3 shifted in their saddles. "You just called a human being property," Jesse said. His voice was low, barely above a murmur, but it carried the way thunder carries across open ground, not loud but impossible to ignore. Silas added from his position against the porch column, "I think you should reconsider your choice of words, Mr. Garrett. On this ranch, we do not consider anyone property, regardless of the color of their skin." Garrett looked at the 3 brothers. He was reading the situation the way a card player reads a table assessing odds, measuring risks. He saw 3 men who were taller than anyone he had hired, who were clearly comfortable with violence, who were standing on their own ground, with the confidence of men who had defended it before. This was not the moment to force the issue. "I understand," Garrett said, taking a measured step backward toward his horse. The smile never faltered. "But I want you gentlemen to be aware that I will return with the county sheriff in a proper court order. And when I do, the situation will become considerably more difficult, for the girl and for anyone sheltering her." Then he paused, looking down at the brothers from horseback, and his voice dropped to something that was almost intimate, almost friendly, and therefore almost terrifying. "Oh, and I should mention that my associate, Gerald Thornton, is offering $500 for the girl's safe return. $500 is a great deal of money in this part of the territory. I wonder how long your principles will hold when that number starts whispering to your neighbors." He turned his horse and rode south. The Whitmore brothers watched until the dust of his departure had settled back to earth and the shimmer of heat had swallowed him completely. Jesse's fist hit the porch column. The wood cracked from top to bottom and blood appeared on his knuckles, but he did not seem to notice either. $500, he said, and each word sounded like it had been dragged across gravel. He put a price on her head, like she is a wanted outlaw. Kaya stepped through the front door. Her face was composed, controlled, but her hands were trembling at her sides. "I should leave," she said. "I am putting all of you in danger. Everything you have built, everything your parents left you, I am putting it at risk just by being here." Caleb turned to face her. His steady gaze held hers and did not release them. "This is your home," he said. "Nobody drives anyone from their home, not on this land." The way he said it, not "this is my home and you are welcome in it," not "I am offering you shelter," but "this is your home," as if it had always been true and he was simply stating a fact that everyone should have already known. Kaya had to turn away because the tears that came were not the kind she could control, and she had spent 6 months learning to control every tear. That night, Rosa found Kaya crying alone in the dark kitchen. The older woman did not ask what was wrong. She did not offer words. She simply sat down on the floor beside the girl and put her arms around her and held her the way a mother holds a daughter, tight and warm and without conditions, and let her cry until there was nothing left. It was the first time since her own mother's death that anyone had held Kaya like that, and it broke something open inside her that needed to be broken open if she was ever going to heal. The next morning, Silas was in the saddle and riding south toward Hillsborough. He found Agnes Henderson in the kitchen of her boarding house, a small, fierce woman in her late 60s who had been running the establishment since her husband John had been killed in a mining accident 20 years ago. She was the kind of woman who knew everything that happened within 50 miles of Hillsborough because she made it her business to know, and because people who stayed at her boarding house tended to talk freely after a few glasses of her homemade wine. She had sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and a tongue that could cut glass when she was irritated, which was most of the time. Silas told her the situation. Mrs. Henderson listened without interrupting, and when he finished, her face had gone from attentive to grim to something that looked very much like fury compressed into a very small space. "Garrett," she said, and the name came out of her mouth the way a person might say the word poison. "That man has been operating in this territory for years, and everyone knows what he does, and nobody does a blessed thing about it because he has money and connections and the good sense to target people that the law does not consider worth protecting." She leaned forward across her kitchen table. "He does not just trade in goods, Mr. Whitmore. He trades in people. Young women mostly. Apache Navajo, sometimes Mexican. He takes them, forges labor contracts to make it look legal, and sells them to men like Thornton, who have the wealth to buy silence along with their victims. I know of at least 3 cases in the past 2 years besides your Kaya." Silas felt the information settle into his chest like a stone. "Can you prove any of this?" Mrs. Henderson rose from the table. She walked to her writing desk, opened a hidden drawer concealed behind a false panel, and withdrew a small leather-bound notebook. It was dirty and dog-eared, its pages soft from handling, and it smelled faintly of whiskey and tobacco. "One of Garrett's former men left this behind 6 months ago," she said, placing it on the table. "He got drunk on my wine and passed out in his room and left it on the nightstand when he stumbled out the next morning." Her blue eyes were blazing. "Inside you will find dates, names, locations, and amounts. It is a ledger of transactions, human transactions. Gerald Thornton's name appears 3 times. Silas picked up the notebook and felt the weight of what it represented. This small object contained evidence that could bring down an entire operation of human trafficking, or it could get every member of his family killed if Garrett learned it existed. "I have been keeping it hidden," Mrs. Henderson said, "waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to use it. Which are you, Mr. Whitmore?" Silas looked at her and smiled, quiet and calm, and carrying the weight of a decision already made. "With my family," he said, "there has never been much difference between the two." Back at the ranch, Garrett was already making his next move, and this one did not involve horses or hired guns. It involved something far more dangerous: words. Within days of his visit to the Double W, stories began circulating through Hillsborough and the surrounding settlements. The Whitmore brothers were harboring a runaway Indian. They were race traders who had taken an Apache woman into their home. They had invited Apache warriors onto white land. The stories grew and mutated the way stories do, each telling, adding new details that had no relationship to truth but had a powerful relationship to fear. The consequences arrived with the efficiency of a rockslide. The general store in Hillsborough refused to sell supplies to anyone from the Double W. A neighbor named Crawford sent a terse note informing him that the Whitmores were no longer welcome on Crawford property. Someone threw a rock through Mrs. Henderson's front window in the middle of the night because she had made the mistake of telling people publicly that the Whitmore brothers were good men and that Garrett was a liar. Jesse wanted to ride into town and deliver his opinions on the subject with his fists. Caleb stopped him. That is exactly what Garrett wants. We fight, we become the villains. He wins without lifting a finger. Kaya knew all of it. She saw the supply wagon come back empty from Hillsborough. She understood with perfect clarity that three men who had been respected members of their community were being transformed into pariahs because of her. The guilt was a physical thing, a weight she carried in her shoulders, and the dark circles that appeared under her eyes. But she did not run. She stayed, she cooked, she worked, and every evening the kitchen had become her territory, the one place where she held undisputed authority, and she defended it with flour and fire, and the quiet stubbornness of a woman who refused to be useless. The attack came on a night when the moon was thin and the darkness was thick enough to hide in. Jesse was riding the south fence line alone, checking the cattle as he did every evening. He was not thinking about the two shapes that detached themselves from the shadow of a rock formation 50 yards to his left. The first shot hit him in the right shoulder, high, punching through muscle and lodging somewhere deep. The impact spun him sideways in the saddle, and he grabbed the horn with his left hand to keep from falling, while his right arm went dead, hanging useless at his side with blood already soaking through his shirt. The second shot went past his head, close enough that he felt the heat of it on his ear. Jesse Whitmore did not panic. Even with a bullet in his shoulder and his gun arm disabled, his body responded with the automatic precision of a man who had been in fights since he was old enough to make fists. He threw himself sideways off the horse, hitting the ground on his good shoulder and rolling behind cover. With his left hand, he drew his revolver and fired 3 times at the muzzle flashes in the darkness. One of his shots found its target. He heard a grunt, then the heavy sound of a body hitting dirt. The second attacker fired again. Jesse aimed and pulled the trigger, and the hammer fell on an empty chamber. He was reaching for spare ammunition when hoofbeats thundered from the east, and Carlos burst from the darkness on horseback, his rifle cracking twice in quick succession. The second attacker broke and ran. Carlos was off his horse and at Jesse's side in seconds. "How bad?" "Shoulder," Jesse said through teeth clenched against the pain. "Bullet is still in there. Get me home." The front door of the ranch house banged open. Carlos, half dragged, half carried Jesse inside, and the kitchen became a field hospital in the space of a single held breath. Jesse was lowered onto the big kitchen table, his face gray and sheened with sweat, blood pooling on the wood surface. And Kaya took command. She did not hesitate. She did not freeze. She did not look to anyone else for instructions. She said in a voice that was sharp and clear and allowed no argument, "Put him on the table, face up. Rosa, boil water. Now, Silas, get the strongest alcohol in this house. For the wound, not for drinking. Caleb, hold him still." She washed her hands in the boiling water and used a knife she had sterilized in flame to open the wound and locate the bullet. Her hands were steady. Her face was focused with an intensity that bordered on ferocity, turned now towards saving rather than surviving. She found the bullet deep in the meat of the shoulder and extracted it with a precision that spoke of training, of watching the healers in her tribe work on warriors who had come back from raids with lead buried in their bodies. She packed the wound with a poultice made from herbs she had been quietly gathering from the hillsides around the ranch. She stitched the wound closed with sinew and a sterilized needle. Then she sat down in a chair beside the table and watched Jesse breathe. She stayed there all night. Caleb sat in the corner of the kitchen, his back against the wall, watching Kaya watch his brother. He did not sleep. Neither did she. Every hour she checked the wound changed. The dressing felt Jesse's forehead for fever, pressed her fingers to his wrist to count his pulse. Silas took a chair outside to the porch and sat with a rifle across his knees, guarding the darkness, his usual humor replaced by a cold, focused vigilance that neither of his brothers had seen from him before. When dawn came and Jesse opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Kaya asleep in the chair beside him. Her head was tilted to one side at an angle that would make her neck sore when she woke. One of her hands rested on his wrist, her fingers still positioned over his pulse point, monitoring him even in sleep. Jesse looked at her for a long time. Then he raised his eyes and found Caleb standing in the kitchen doorway. "Hey." The two brothers exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Jesse nodded once, a small movement that meant everything. From that moment forward, anyone who wanted to harm Kaya would have to go through Jesse Whitmore to do it, and going through Jesse Whitmore was something that very few people on Earth were equipped to accomplish. In the days that followed, while Jesse recovered, Caleb and Kaya spent more time together than they had before. With Jesse confined to bed and Silas dividing his time between ranch duties and riding guard on the property perimeter, Caleb needed help in the fields. Kaya volunteered without being asked. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, mending fence, moving cattle, checking water sources. And as they worked, they talked. Not the careful, measured conversation of strangers, but the deeper exchange of people who had crossed some invisible threshold and now found themselves in territory where honesty was the only currency that mattered. Caleb told her about his father, about the man who had arrived in New Mexico territory with nothing but a land deed and a stubborn conviction that he could build something lasting. He told her about his mother, Eleanor, who had come from Maine and hated the desert for the first 2 years, and then slowly, reluctantly fallen in love with its savage beauty, the same way she had fallen in love with James Whitmore himself against her better judgment and with her whole heart. Kaya told him about her people, about the rhythms of seasonal movement, the deep knowledge of the land that was passed from generation to generation like a sacred text written in memory rather than on paper. She told him about her birth father, who had been a quiet man, a thinker rather than a fighter, who believed that the Apache and the white settlers could learn to coexist. She told Caleb that her father had died, still believing that, with a bullet in his chest and his hand reaching toward his daughter. In the evenings, they sat on the porch while the sun performed its nightly spectacle over the mesas. Caleb talked about astronomy, pointing out constellations and telling her the Greek myths attached to them. Kaya told him the Apache names for the same star patterns and the stories her people had built around them over thousands of years. They realized together that two cultures had looked up at the same sky for centuries and seen completely different stories, and both sets of stories were beautiful and both were true. Kaya had begun drawing again using charcoal sticks on brown packing paper, and her sketches were remarkable. One afternoon, Caleb found a drawing she had hidden inside a book in the kitchen, a portrait of him standing on the porch looking out at the distance, the late afternoon light falling across his face. She had captured something in his expression that he did not know was there, a combination of strength and loneliness and quiet longing that made him stare at the drawing for a very long time and feel his heart beating in places he had not known it could reach. The moment that neither of them could pretend away happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Caleb was teaching Kaya to check a horse's hooves, and they were both crouched beside the animal's foreleg when the horse startled and jerked its leg. Kaya lost her balance and pitched forward, and Caleb caught her, his hands on her waist, and for a long, suspended moment, they were closer to each other than they had ever been. His hands on her waist, her face inches from his. Neither of them breathed. The world contracted to the space between their bodies, a space that was warm and charged and full of something that had been building for weeks and could not be contained much longer. Chaos stepped back first, not out of fear. Caleb could see clearly that there was no fear in her eyes. What was there instead was recognition, the understanding that if she did not step back now, she would not want to step back ever, and she was not yet certain she was allowed to want that. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had a tremor in it that had nothing to do with the horse, "for always catching me." "I will always catch you," Caleb replied. Then he turned and walked toward the barn because he did not trust himself to keep looking at her, and because the promise he had just made was echoing in his chest like a bell that had been struck and would not stop ringing. The morning everything changed began like any other morning, with Caleb rising before dawn and stepping onto the porch. But this morning Miguel was already there, and his face was the color of old ashes. "You need to come see this," Miguel said, "right now." Standing on the ridgeline 300 yards to the north, silhouetted against the pink and gold of the rising sun, were 7 Apache warriors on horseback. They sat their mounts in perfect stillness, arranged in a line along the crest of the hill, like figures carved into the sky itself. Their horses were painted, their weapons were visible, and in the center of the line, mounted on a tall roan stallion, sat a man who radiated authority the way the desert radiated heat. He was in his early 50s, lean and hard, with the ropey musculature of a man who had been fighting and riding and surviving since before most of the people in this territory were born. 2 parallel scars ran down his left cheek, old and silver white, against his dark skin, and his eyes were black, not brown, but truly black, the kind of eyes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Across his lap, he held a rifle that was newer and better maintained than anything Caleb owned. Nanton, Kaya's foster father, the warrior chief who had survived Garrett's attack, who had spent 6 months rebuilding and searching for his lost daughter, and who was now sitting on a hill above the ranch where she had taken shelter, looking down with the patient, calculating gaze of a man deciding whether to burn everything below him to the ground. Jesse came out of this house with his good hand on his revolver. Silas appeared behind him. Both brothers went very still. "I'm going out to meet him," Caleb said. "Alone, no weapons." Jesse's reaction was immediate. "Have you lost your mind? 7 armed warriors on that hill, and you want to walk out there barehanded? If I walk out there with a gun, we are all dead before I cover half of the distance. If I walk out there with open hands, there is a chance to talk." Caleb looked at his brother. "Jesse, I need you to trust me." Silas put his hand on Jesse's good shoulder. "Trust him," he said quietly. Caleb stepped off the porch. He removed his gun belt and hung it on the fence post. He took off his hat and held it at his side so his face was clearly visible. Then he walked north across the open ground toward the hill where 7 warriors waited with weapons that could end his life before he took another breath. Every step felt like walking into deep water. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his stride was steady and his hands were open at his sides and his face showed nothing except respect and the absence of fear. He stopped at the base of the hill and spoke in Spanish, the only language they might share. "I know why you are here. I know what was taken from you. I would ride to the edge of the world to bring back someone I loved, and I would burn anything that stood in my way. But I am asking you to come down. Come into my home. Eat with us. Talk to your daughter. If she wants to leave with you, I will not stop her. You have my word." Nantan studied him. The black eyes moved across Caleb's face with the thoroughness of a man reading terrain before a battle. Whatever he saw made him reach a decision. He dismounted. Kaya was standing in the kitchen when Nantan walked through the door. She froze. Then a sound came from her throat that was not a word in any language, but was understood by everyone who heard it, a sound of recognition and grief and love and pain, all compressed into a single raw syllable that made Rosa press her hand to her mouth and made even Jesse look away. Nantan crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and took Kaya into his arms, and she buried her face against his chest and held on as if the earth were trying to throw her off. And he was the only solid thing in the world. Kaya cooked. She made food that bridged both worlds. Apache corn, porridge made with ranch beef, fry bread with honey from the hives Miguel kept behind the barn, wild herbs mixed with pantry ingredients. She moved between the 2 groups, speaking Apache to her people and English to the Whitmores, and everyone who watched her understood something that no one said aloud. She belonged to both of these worlds, and because she belonged to both, she belonged completely to neither. In the afternoon, Kaya and Nantan walked to the hill behind the house to talk privately. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Nantan wanted her to return. The band was moving north. She would be safe among her own people. Kaya told him what she had been thinking about since the day she arrived. "Father, if I come back, Garrett will follow my trail to the band. He has Apache scouts who track for him. I will lead him straight to our people. Here at least I draw his attention away from the tribe. Here I can fight from a position where people stand beside me." Nantan had watched the ranch all day. He had observed the way Caleb treated Kaya not as a possession or a charity case, but as a partner. He had watched Jesse guard her with the protective ferocity of a brother. He had watched Silas make her laugh, a sound he had not heard from his foster daughter since the morning Garrett's men had come with guns and fire. And he had seen what Kaya was not yet ready to admit, the way her gaze followed Caleb whenever he moved through a room. "You love that man," Nantan said. The silence answered for her. Before he left, Nantan found Caleb alone by the corral. "My daughter has chosen to stay," he said in Spanish. "I do not agree with her choice, but I respect her will. I have always taught her to follow her heart, and I cannot take back that teaching now simply because her heart has led her somewhere I did not expect." Then he stepped closer, and his voice became something less than a whisper and more than a threat. "If any harm comes to her under your protection, any harm at all, I will return, and there will be no talking." Caleb looked into those black eyes and felt the full weight of what was being communicated. "If I were you," Caleb said, "I would say exactly the same thing." Nantan rode north with his warriors. Kaya stood on the porch watching them go. As Nantan reached the ridgeline, he turned in his saddle. Kaya raised her hand and placed it flat against her chest over her heart. Across 300 yards of desert air, Nantan returned the gesture. Then he was gone. That night, Caleb found Kaya sitting alone in the dark kitchen. She was past crying. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on nothing. Caleb did not speak. He sat down beside her on the kitchen floor and put a cup of hot coffee into her hands. They sat in silence for a long time, their shoulders touching, the coffee cooling the stars wheeling slowly past the window. Finally, Kaya said, "I chose this, but choosing does not mean it does not hurt." Caleb said, "I know, and you do not have to pretend it does not. Not here, not with me." Garrett returned 2 weeks later with Sheriff Cooper in an official court document. Cooper was visibly uncomfortable, sweating through his shirt, but he was there because Garrett had either threatened him or paid him or both. Caleb deployed the information about his father's wartime service with Governor Sheldon like a precisely aimed weapon, suggesting that a letter to Santa Fe might trigger an investigation reaching beyond Garrett. Sheriff Cooper went pale. They withdrew, but everyone knew it was a tactical retreat. Then came the day that broke everything open. Caleb and Jesse had ridden to the western pasture. Silas had gone to Hillsboro. The ranch was quiet. A man rode up wearing a tin badge and carrying papers with official seals. He said he was a deputy from Santa Fe with a warrant. He said if Kaya did not come willingly, every person on the property would be arrested. Kaya looked at Rosa, whose face had gone white. She looked toward the barn where Miguel was working, an old man who had given his entire life to this ranch. She thought of the 3 brothers who had risked everything to protect her. She went with the man. Before she left, she told Rosa, "Tell Caleb not to come after me. I do not want anyone else hurt because of me." When Caleb returned at dusk and learned what had happened, his reaction frightened everyone who witnessed it. He did not shout. He did not strike anything. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, perfectly still, and something in his face changed. The warmth went out of it. The patience went out of it. What remained was the face of a man in whom something essential had shifted from deliberate to absolute, from the weighing of options to a single fixed point of certainty that nothing in the world was going to move. He said 3 words: "Saddle the horses." 4 riders left the Double W at a gallop. Caleb on Thunder, the tall black gelding. Jesse, his shoulders still wrapped, riding one-handed. Silas, who had returned from Hillsboro to find chaos and had turned his horse around without dismounting. And Carlos, young and scared and utterly loyal. They caught them 40 minutes south of the ranch. The false deputy was riding at a moderate pace with Kaya beside him. The brothers came at him from 3 directions. Jesse from the right flank, Silas from behind, Carlos swinging wide to cover the eastern trail, and Caleb straight up the center at full gallop. The man drew his gun and fired. The bullet clipped the brim of Caleb's hat and sent it spinning into the dust. Caleb did not slow down. Jesse fired from the flank, hitting the man's gun hand. The revolver fell, and then Caleb launched himself from Thunder's back at full gallop and hit the man like a landslide. Kaya was already free. She had cut her own bonds during the ride using a sharp-edged stone she had concealed inside her moccasin boot, a lesson learned from her months of captivity. She walked to where Caleb stood over the beaten man, and she said in a voice that carried the cold authority of a woman who had survived things that would have broken most people on earth, "Tell Garrett this. Next time he sends someone better, because these men will not miss." Then she turned to Caleb, and only then did the tears come. They came silently rolling down her dust-streaked cheeks, and Caleb stepped forward, and she stepped forward, and they stood together on that desert road with the sunset blazing behind them, and neither of them said a word because there were no words for this. Jesse, Silas, and Carlos rode ahead to give them privacy. It was Jesse's idea, which surprised no one more than Jesse himself. Caleb stopped on the hill that overlooked the ranch. Below them, the Double W spread out in the fading light, the adobe house glowing amber in the sunset. The sky above the western mesas was painted in colors that had no names. "Kaya," Caleb said, and his voice was raw, stripped of every layer of composure he normally maintained. "When I found out you were gone, it felt like someone had ripped the ground out from under me. And I realized something I should have said weeks ago." Kaya looked at him. Her dark gaze held the sunset and the tears and something else, something that had been growing in silence for weeks and was ready now to be spoken aloud. "I love you," Caleb said, "not because you need saving, not because I feel sorry for you, but because you are the strongest, most extraordinary person I have ever known. Because you walked through hell and came out standing. Because you can look at the same stars I look at and see stories I have never heard and make me realize the sky is bigger than I thought. I love you, and I do not want to imagine a single day of my life without you in it. Kea smiled through her tears, and the smile was like sunrise, something that starts small and then fills the entire sky. You know this is complicated, she said. Your world and mine, they do not mix easily. Then we make our own world, Caleb said, right here on this land, where it does not matter where you come from, only where you choose to go. Kea reached out and took his hand. Her fingers scarred and calloused and strong laced through his fingers, scarred and calloused and strong, and they fit together as if they had been designed for this specific purpose. I choose here, she said. I choose you. When they reached the porch, Silas was waiting with 2 cups of coffee because Silas always knew what was needed before anyone asked. He looked at their joined hands and nodded with quiet satisfaction. Then he held out his open palm toward Jesse, who was lowering himself carefully into a porch chair. Jesse glared at him, reached into his pocket, and dropped a crumpled bill into Silas's hand. Worst bet I ever made, Jesse said. Silas folded the money and tucked it into his vest. Best bet I ever made, he corrected. The 4 of them sat on the porch as the last light died over the mesas and the first stars appeared in the vast New Mexico sky. Nobody spoke for a long time. Nobody needed to. The coffee was hot and the evening was cool, and somewhere inside the house, Rosa was singing softly while she cooked, and for this one perfect moment, the storms that had been battering them from 2 directions were quiet and the people on the porch were together, and that was enough. Caleb Whitmore had never been a man who confused sentiment with strategy. He loved Kaya with a certainty that had settled into his bones the way bedrock settles beneath soil, permanent and beyond argument. But he also understood that love alone would not protect her. In the territory of New Mexico in 1882, a man's feelings for a woman meant exactly nothing in a courtroom. What mattered was paper. What mattered was law. What mattered was the cold mechanical language of contracts and certificates and documents bearing official seals. Marriage would make Kaya the legal wife of an American citizen. It would give her standing in a system that currently regarded her as something between a person and a piece of property. It would strip Garrett of any contractual claim and force any future legal challenge through the full apparatus of territorial courts, where a married woman had rights that an unmarried Apache woman did not. Caleb understood this not because he was cynical about love, but because he was realistic about the world they lived in, and realism had kept his family alive through 6 years of drought, disease, rustlers, and everything else the territory had thrown at them. He explained this to Kaya the morning after the rescue, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them. He laid it out plainly, treating her as the intelligent partner she was, rather than a woman who needed to be handled delicately. Kaya listened. She understood the logic perfectly, and she said nothing for a very long time. She left the kitchen without speaking and walked out to the garden behind the house. It was Eleanor Whitmore's garden, the one Kaya had been tending since her first week at the ranch. She knelt between the rows of beans and squash and pressed her hands flat against the warm red earth, and she stayed there for nearly an hour, motionless, her lips moving occasionally in what might have been Apache words, or might have been the formless dialogue a person carries on with their own heart when the decision before them is too large for logic alone. The conflict inside her was not about Caleb. She loved him. That was settled. The conflict was about identity, about what it meant to be Apache in a world that was systematically erasing her people from the land they had inhabited for centuries, about what it meant to marry a white man, to take his name, to stand in his church before his God and speak vows in his language. She could hear Nantan's voice in her memory. Never forget who you are. She was terrified not of Caleb, but of losing herself, of waking up one morning and realizing that the girl who had run barefoot through canyon country and known the names of every star in Apache and carried her father's bone pendant like a talisman against forgetting had become someone she no longer recognized. It was Silas who found her in the garden, and Silas who said the thing that unlocked the door she had been pushing against. He sat down on the dirt beside her, cross-legged, completely unconcerned about the mud on his trousers. He did not ask her what was wrong because Silas had the rare gift of understanding people well enough to know the question before it was asked, and the rarer gift of knowing when to answer it without being invited. You know what I love about this ranch? He said, squinting up at the sky as if the answer were written in the clouds. It was built by a man from Virginia and a woman from Maine, 2 people from 2 different worlds who had nothing in common except a piece of land and a stubborn refusal to let the desert beat them. They did not stop being who they were when they married each other. My father never lost his Virginia drawl, and my mother never stopped complaining about the heat. But they became something new together, something that was bigger and better than either of them alone. He looked at Kaya, and his usual humor was replaced by a sincerity that was all the more powerful for being rare. Marry my brother Kaya, not because it will fix everything, not because it is the strategic thing to do, although it is, but because love this good does not come around twice in a lifetime. And anyone who tells you that loving someone from a different world means losing yourself has never actually tried it. Kaya looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Your mother raised you well, Silas." "She raised all three of us well," Silas replied with a grin. "But I was always her favorite. Do not tell the other two." That afternoon, Kaya found Caleb in the barn and told him yes. Not with a speech, not with tears or grand declarations. She walked up to him while he was brushing thunder, and she put her hand on his arm and said, "Yes, I will marry you. Not because it is safe, because I choose you." Caleb set down the brush and turned to face her, and for a moment the two of them stood in the dusty golden light of the barn, with hay motes floating around them like tiny stars. And the hard lines of his face eased into the expression she had first seen on a moonlit trail, and Kaya smiled back, and the barn smelled of horses and leather and hay and possibility. Then Garrett made his final move. The news reached the ranch through Carlos, who had ridden to Hillsboro for supplies, and come back at a gallop, his horse lathered and blowing. Gerald Thornton had arrived in Hillsboro. The man himself, the mine owner from Santa Fe, who had purchased Kaya like livestock and kept her in a locked room. He was there in person, fat and red-faced, and accompanied by Garrett and a lawyer from Santa Fe, and they had filed a petition with the territorial court demanding the return of one Apache female described in the documents as an indentured servant who had violated a lawful labor contract. The hearing was set for the following morning. The timing was surgical. Garrett had waited until the eve of the marriage to strike, knowing that if the court ruled in his favor, before the ceremony could take place, Kaya would have no legal protection at all. The evening before the hearing, the ranch was quiet in the way that a battlefield is quiet before dawn. Miguel sat on the porch cleaning a rifle he had no intention of firing, but found comfort in maintaining. Rosa cooked a dinner that was more elaborate than the situation warranted because Rosa believed that feeding people well was a form of prayer. Carlos checked and rechecked the horses. Jesse sat in a corner of the kitchen, sharpening a knife with long, slow strokes that were meditative rather than menacing. Silas was at the table with the leather notebook from Mrs. Henderson, reading through it for the 10th time, memorizing details. And Caleb and Kaya stood on the porch together as the sun went down, not touching, not speaking, watching the desert perform its nightly transformation. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Kaya said, "I want you to know that these weeks have been the best of my life, not because I was safe, although I was, but because for the first time someone saw me. Not the Apache girl, not the runaway, not the victim. Me." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "Tomorrow we fight," he said, "and we win, because I did not find you in that wagon just to lose you in a courtroom." The Hillsboro Courthouse was a single-room wooden building that served as church meeting hall, schoolroom, and seat of justice depending on the day. It had plank walls, a tin roof that amplified the heat like an oven, 6 rows of mismatched wooden chairs, and a raised platform at the front. By 8 in the morning, the room was packed. Word had spread through the town the way fire spreads through dry grass, and every chair was occupied, and people were standing along the walls 3 deep. The Whitmore party arrived together. Caleb walked in first wearing a clean white shirt and the best coat he owned. Behind him came Jesse, who had tucked in his shirt and removed the most visible weapons from his person, though anyone who looked carefully would have noticed the outline of a revolver under his coat. Silas followed, and in his inside coat pocket was the leather notebook. Miguel and Carlos came next, scrubbed and uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes. Rosa walked with her head high and her jaw set, and then Kaya entered the room. She wore her Apache deerskin dress, not the torn garment from the night Caleb found her. This dress had been repaired over the preceding weeks with meticulous care, each tear mended with stitching so fine it was nearly invisible. She had added new beadwork along the yoke turquoise and red ochre and bone white in traditional patterns. And along the hem embroidered with thread she had made from plant fiber using techniques her mother had taught her, were small sprigs of lavender, the flower she had found growing wild in Eleanor Whitmore's garden. It was a dress that belonged to both of her worlds, Apache craftsmanship honoring the heritage she carried in her blood. Frontier wildflowers honoring the home she had chosen. Around her neck hung the bone pendant carved in the shape of a running horse. She walked through that courtroom full of white faces with her back straight and her chin lifted and her eyes burning with the quiet fire that Caleb had first seen in the bed of his wagon. She was not performing defiance. She simply was defiant the way water is wet and fire is hot, as if fundamental property of her nature. Caleb said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You look like a warrior." Kale met his eyes. "I am one." Judge Samuel Harrison was a man in his middle 50s with a lean face and spectacles. He was new to the district, transferred from a post in the eastern part of the territory, and he had no existing relationship with either side. He was a genuine neutral party, which meant the outcome would depend entirely on the evidence presented. Garrett presented his case first. He produced a labor contract, a document that bore Kaya's mark in X beside a line that allegedly represented her voluntary agreement to work for Thornton for 5 years. He produced 2 witnesses who swore she had signed freely. And he produced Gerald Thornton himself, who took the witness chair and described his arrangement with Kaya in terms that made Caleb's hands curl into fists beneath the table. Thornton spoke about Kaya the way a man speaks about a horse he has purchased at auction. He referenced the price he had paid, $500, as if the number itself constituted proof of ownership. He described her physical characteristics as if reading from a bill of sale. Sitting in the gallery, Rosa crossed herself and whispered something in Spanish that was almost certainly not a prayer for Thornton's well-being. Caleb responded with what he had. He testified that Kaya had been working at the Double W as a paid employee of her own free will. Miguel confirmed this from the stand. Caleb argued that the contract was fraudulent because Kaya could not read or write English and therefore could not have understood what she was agreeing to. But the contract looked authentic. The seals looked real. The witnesses had sworn their oaths with the practiced ease of men who had been paid well to lie convincingly. And Caleb could feel the room tilting against them, could feel the judge's neutral expression hardening into something that looked uncomfortably like a decision already being formed. Then Kaya stood up. The room went silent, not the polite silence of people waiting for someone to speak, the shocked silence of people watching something they did not believe was possible. An Apache woman rising to address a white man's court was in the experience of everyone present unprecedented. Kaya spoke in English, clear measured English that carried the distinctive cadence of her Apache mother tongue underneath it like a river running beneath ice. She did not plead. She did not weep. She did not perform the role of helpless victim because she was not one, and she refused to pretend otherwise, even if pretending might have won sympathy. She simply told the truth. "Your Honor, I cannot read or write the English language well enough to sign any contract. I do not know what that paper says because no one ever read it to me. But I can tell you exactly what happened because I was there and I remember every detail, and I will remember every detail until the day I die." She told the story. Dates, locations, names, the dawn attack on her settlement, her father shot through the chest, her mother killed in the crossfire, the capture, the transport south with her hands bound and a canvas bag over her head, the room in Santa Fe where Thornton kept her, a room with a lock on the outside and bars on the window and scratches on the walls that had been put there by the women who came before her. She told them about those women, 2 of them. The first had been called Mary by Thornton because he could not be bothered to learn her Apache name. She had died of what the doctor called fever, but what Kaya knew was despair because Mary had stopped eating and stopped speaking and stopped wanting to be alive. The second woman had tried to escape and had been caught and had died from injuries the official record described as the result of a fall. Kaya told all of this in a flat, steady voice without dramatic pauses, without appeals to emotion, without anything except the bare, terrible architecture of facts laid down one after another like stones in a wall. The room was so quiet that the sound of a horse passing outside seemed to come from another world. When she finished, Silas rose from his seat and walked to the front of the room. He placed the leather notebook on the judge's table. "Your Honor, this ledger was left behind at the Henderson boarding house by a former associate of Mr. Garrett. It contains dates, names, and financial figures documenting multiple transactions involving the purchase and sale of indigenous women in the New Mexico territory over the past 2 years. The name Gerald Thornton appears 3 times. Judge Harrison picked up the notebook and began to read. As he turned the pages, his face underwent a transformation that everyone in the room could see, a slow darkening that started around his eyes and spread outward until his entire expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to something colder and harder and infinitely more dangerous for the men who had brought this case before him. From the gallery, Agnes Henderson stood up. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, and she had to push past 3 large men to reach the aisle, which she did with the determined energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for this moment. She confirmed everything. Kaya's employment at her boarding house, the night Garrett's men had threatened Kaya, the circumstances under which the notebook had come into her possession. Judge Harrison closed the notebook. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them on his sleeve. Then he put them back on and looked at Garrett and Thornton with an expression that would have made a braver man than either of them flinch. "The labor contract presented to this court is hereby declared void on grounds of fraud," he said, and his voice had the quality of a hammer driving nails into a coffin. "The evidence before me strongly suggests that the document was obtained through coercion from a person who was not competent to understand its contents, and that it was used as a legal instrument to facilitate what amounts to the purchase and enslavement of a human being. The woman known as Kaya is declared free and is under no obligation, legal or otherwise, to any party in this room." He paused. The room held its breath. "Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into the activities of Randolph Garrett and Gerald Thornton, as documented in this ledger. Sheriff Cooper, you will hold both men in custody pending the arrival of territorial investigators from Santa Fe." Garrett shot to his feet, his carefully maintained composure shattering like glass. His face went crimson and his voice cracked into something raw and ugly. "This is an outrage. She is a savage. You cannot possibly take her word over the testimony of respectable white men." Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a crack that silenced the room. "One more word, Mr. Garrett, and I will hold you in contempt of this court. Sit down." Thornton rose quietly from his chair and began moving toward the side door with the furtive urgency of a rat heading for a hole. Jesse was leaning against the wall beside that door. He had positioned himself there at the start of the hearing because Jesse always positioned himself between his people and the nearest exit. "Going somewhere, Mr. Thornton," Jesse said, and his voice was almost conversational, which made it infinitely more frightening than a shout would have been. "The judge has some questions for you. I would suggest you take a seat and answer them." Thornton sat down. Kaya walked out of the courthouse into sunlight. She stood on the top step and felt the warmth on her face and closed her eyes and breathed it in, and the breath she drew was the first free breath she had taken in nearly a year. Not free because she had escaped before, and freedom won through. Running is always temporary, always looking over its shoulder. This was different. This was freedom recognized and declared by the same system that had denied it. This was a piece of paper with a judge's signature that said she was a person and not a commodity, and while a piece of paper should not have been necessary to establish something so fundamental in this world in this time, it was. Caleb was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He stood with his hat in his hands and his chestnut hair catching the midday light, and his expression combining relief and love and pride and the particular tenderness of a strong man who has just watched the woman he loves fight a battle he could not fight for her and win. He did not speak. He extended his hand. Kaya came down the steps and took it. They were married that afternoon in the small white church at the eastern edge of Hillsborough. Reverend Thomas, the elderly minister who tended the church and its garden with equal devotion, agreed to perform the ceremony. Mrs. Henderson served as witness, weeping openly from the moment she entered the church. Her husband John served as second witness. Jesse and Silas stood beside Caleb, and Rosa sat in the first pew with Miguel and Carlos. Kaya wore her Apache dress with its mended tears and new beadwork and embroidered lavender. Rosa had gathered wildflowers from the roadside that morning and woven them into a simple crown that sat in Kaya's black hair among the feathers and turquoise beads. She carried nothing. She needed nothing. She walked down the narrow aisle with the stride of a woman who had crossed deserts and survived captivity and spoken truth to power, and she did not need anyone to give her away because she was giving herself freely and completely to the man waiting at the altar. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Thomas spoke the words with simple dignity, and when he asked Caleb if he took this woman, Caleb looked at Kaya and said, "I do, and I have since the day I found her." When the Reverend asked Kaya, she said, "I do. He is the best man I have ever known." Silas cried, freely and abundantly, and without a shred of embarrassment, wiping his face with his sleeve and grinning through the tears. Jesse stood rigid and stone-faced beside his brother, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the way he blinked more than usual during the exchange of vows. The Reverend told Caleb he could kiss his bride. Caleb leaned forward and kissed Kaya gently, briefly, with the tenderness of a man handling something infinitely precious, in the late afternoon light pouring through the church windows wrapped around them in shades of gold. Mrs. Henderson hugged Kaya fiercely and then turned to Caleb and said, "If you do not treat her right, I will come find you. And I am scarier than any Apache warrior." Caleb laughed, and it was the first time in the entire story that the sound of his laughter had filled a room warm and real and unburdened. They rode home as husband and wife. When they crested the hill that overlooked the Double W, Kaya said, "It looks different now." Caleb asked how. She said, "It looks like home. Before today, it looked like shelter. Now it looks like home." Rosa had prepared a feast. They ate and they laughed, and Miguel raised a glass and said something in Spanish that made Rosa cry and Carlos blush. Silas told a story about the time Jesse had fallen into the water trough while trying to break a horse, and Jesse threatened to demonstrate on Silas what a fall into a water trough actually felt like. And Kaya laughed until her sides ached, and Caleb watched her laughing and felt his chest fill with something so large and warm that he thought it might crack his ribs from the inside. That night, in the room that had been Eleanor's sewing room and was now theirs, the door closed softly. And when morning came, everything had changed between them in the way that everything changes between two people who have chosen each other completely and sealed that choice with their whole hearts. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. They were something better. They were real. Kaya became a full partner in the management of the Double W, bringing her knowledge of the land to bear on problems that had frustrated the brothers for years. She identified water sources they had overlooked, read weather patterns that allowed them to move cattle ahead of storms, and introduced grazing rotation techniques that improved the pastures measurably within a single season. Caleb listened to her the way he listened to a fellow rancher whose expertise complemented his own with respect and attention, and this, more than any words of love, was what told Kaya she had married the right man. Jesse became her most ferocious defender. One evening in the Hillsborough saloon, a drunk cowboy referred to Kaya with words so ugly that even the other drinkers flinched. Jesse broke the man's nose before the last syllable had left his mouth. Silas, who happened to be present, settled the bill for damaged furniture and said, "Put it on our tab. There will probably be more." Silas and Kaya developed the warm, teasing relationship of true siblings. He called her the most terrifying sister-in-law in all of New Mexico, and she called him the worst cook in the history of human civilization. The investigation ordered by Judge Harrison took 6 months. The notebook combined with Kaya's testimony and the testimony of other victims, the investigation uncovered built an irrefutable case. Randolph Garrett was convicted of human trafficking, kidnapping, and fraud. Gerald Thornton was caught attempting to flee across the Texas border and brought back in chains. Both received heavy prison sentences. Kaya stood in the courtroom on the day of sentencing. She stood in the back row, straight-backed, dry-eyed, silent. She did not speak. Her presence in that room, alive and free and unbowed, was the most powerful statement anyone could have made. Garrett looked at her as he was led away in irons, and for the first and only time she saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of prison, fear of the woman he had tried to break and failed. 5 months after the wedding, Kaya told Caleb she was carrying their child. Caleb began building an addition to the house that same afternoon before Kaya had finished her breakfast. Jesse disappeared into the barn and spent every free hour for 3 months building a cradle from oak, carving the headboard with a patience and precision that no one who knew him as the quick-tempered gunfighter would have believed possible. Silas declared himself the future best uncle in all of New Mexico territory and began a campaign to choose the baby's name that involved increasingly absurd suggestions delivered at every meal. The boy was born on a cool spring morning in 1883, arriving with a cry that rang through the adobe house like a bell. They named him James Nantan Whitmore. James for the grandfather who had built the ranch from nothing. Nantan for the Apache warrior chief who had loved Kaya enough to let her go. When Caleb held his son for the first time, his hands shook. These were the hands that had punched a man to the ground to save the woman he loved. The hands that had gripped reins and fence wire and revolver handles and the rough edges of a life that required constant physical strength. They trembled now, holding 7 pounds of new life wrapped in a blanket Rosa had sewn, because there is no strength on earth that prepares a man for the weight of his own child. Kaya watched him and said, "He has your eyes." Caleb looked down at the tiny face at eyes that were amber brown, lighter than Kaya's, and darker than his own, a blend that belonged to neither heritage alone, but to the new thing they had created between them. He has the best of both of us, Caleb said. 2 months after the birth, Nantan came. He came alone this time, without warriors, without weapons visible, riding a single horse down the North Trail in the blue light of early morning. Nantan did not ask permission to enter the house. He walked to the room where Kaya sat with the baby, and he stood in the doorway, and his scarred, weathered face did something that Kaya had not seen it do since she was a small child. It softened. The warrior chief stood in a doorway in a white man's house and looked at a baby and became for a moment simply a grandfather. Kaya placed James in Nantan's arms. The old warrior held the infant with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the size and hardness of his hands. He looked down at the small face, and then he began to sing low and quiet an Apache lullaby that Kaya remembered from her own childhood, a song about stars and running water, and the spirit of the wind that watches over children while they sleep. James, who had been fussing, went silent immediately, his tiny eyes fixed on the old man's face as if recognizing something ancient and important. Nantan stayed 3 days. He and Caleb never became friends. The distance between them was too vast, carved by history and pain. But they achieved something rarer and more valuable than friendship. They achieved mutual respect, the genuine article earned through recognizing in the other man a capacity for love and sacrifice that transcended the boundaries of culture and blood. On the morning Nantan left, he gave baby James a small bracelet made of leather and turquoise beads, an Apache protective charm that had been in his family for generations. Then he looked at Caleb and said in Spanish, "Take care of my family, mountain man." Caleb answered, "With my life." Nantan rode north. Kaya, standing on the porch with James in her arms, saw him raise his hand and press it to his chest as he crested the hill, and she returned the gesture, and something in the morning light made them both shimmer for a moment before he disappeared over the ridge. The years that followed moved with the relentless rhythm of seasons turning, and children growing, and a ranch expanding under the care of people who loved it. Caleb bought the adjacent property when old Mr. Sanders retired, doubling the size of the Double W. Jesse married Anna, the daughter of the general store owner in Hillsboro, a woman who had the distinction of being one of the few people on earth capable of making Jesse Whitmore behave himself in public. Carlos married his sweetheart Maria, and Caleb helped him build a cabin on the ranch property. Silas, who had loudly proclaimed for years that he was far too interesting to be domesticated, fell helplessly in love with a schoolteacher from Santa Fe named Eleanor, and the fact that she shared a name with his mother was a coincidence that Jesse and Caleb exploited mercilessly at every opportunity. Kaya bore 3 more children: Sarah Callao in 1885, a girl with her mother's fierce, dark gaze and her father's quiet determination; Michael in 1887, a dreamy boy who inherited Caleb's love of stars and could name every constellation in both English and Apache before he was 10; and Elizabeth in 1890, the baby of the family who drew and painted with a talent that came from Kaya and filled every wall of the house with color and life. The 4 children grew up between 2 worlds and were richer for it. They spoke English and Apache. They ate biscuits and fry bread. They knew the stars by their Western names and their Apache stories. They understood, because their parents taught them by example rather than lecture, that the world was larger than any single culture's understanding of it, and that the greatest strength came not from choosing one identity over another, but from holding both and finding the place where they met. Koya transformed the ranch into something more than a cattle operation. She made it a refuge. Over the years, women came to the Double W, indigenous women who had been taken and abused, and discarded women who had nowhere else to go. Kaya gave them work and shelter and time to heal. Some stayed and became permanent members of the extended ranch family. Others moved on to build new lives elsewhere. Caleb supported her completely, understanding that this work was central to who Kaya was, the expression of a promise she had made to herself in the dark room in Santa Fe, a promise that if she survived, she would make sure no other woman went through what she had gone through alone. On a warm summer evening in 1895, 13 years after a wagon wheel hit a rut on a dusty trail, Caleb and Kaya sat on the porch of their home watching the sun go down. The ranch spread out around them in every direction, vast and green and alive. James, 12 now, and already showing signs of the height he would inherit from his father, was working with the cattle in the south pasture beside Carlos, learning the rhythms of the herd the way Caleb had learned them at the same age. Sarah was helping Rosa in the kitchen, their voices carrying faintly through the open windows. Michael was somewhere on the property with a telescope Caleb had given him for his birthday, probably already setting up for a night of stargazing. Elizabeth was on the porch steps with a sketchbook drawing the sunset in colored pencils, with a concentration so intense she did not notice the cat sleeping on her foot. Jesse and Anna were in their cabin nearby. Silas and his Eleanor were coming for dinner. Miguel, white-haired now and slower than he used to be, but still rising before dawn. Every morning was sitting on his own porch with a grandchild on each knee. "Do you remember the night you found me?" Kaya asked. Caleb smiled. It was the same expression unchanged after 13 years, the one that had started everything. "I pulled back the tarp and I saw the most beautiful and most terrifying thing I had ever laid eyes on. A woman with fire in her eyes who looked like she could either collapse or kill me." Kaya laughed. "I was considering both." "I am glad you chose neither," Caleb said and took her hand. "Caleb," Kaya said, and her voice was serious now, carrying the weight of everything they had been through and everything they had built. "You did not just save my life that night. You gave me a world where I could be Apache and a rancher's wife and a mother and myself all at once. I never believed that was possible." "You built that world," Caleb corrected gently. "I just gave you the land." They sat together as the sky turned from gold to crimson to deep violet. Their hands clasped their shoulders, touching, watching the desert put on its evening clothes. Behind them, the house glowed with lamplight and the sounds of family gathering for dinner. Ahead of them, the land stretched to the horizon, vast and ancient and beautiful beyond the capacity of any single language to describe. Many years later, when Caleb died peacefully in his sleep, his hand was still holding Kaya's. Jesse and Silas were beside the bed, gray-haired now, but still tall, still strong, still standing shoulder to shoulder the way they had stood their entire lives. Jesse gripped the bedpost until his knuckles went white. Silas pressed his forehead against the wall, and the sound that came from both of them, low and broken and raw, filled the room the way wind fills a canyon with the weight of something vast and irreversible passing through. Kaya lived 5 more years. She spent them writing. In a leather-bound journal using both English and Apache, she set down the story of her life, wanting the generations that came after to know how it had begun and what it had meant. She was buried beside Caleb on the hill overlooking the ranch, the hill where they had watched 1,000 sunsets together and named the stars in 2 languages. At her funeral, James read the final passage from his mother's journal. The family stood on the hilltop, 4 children and their spouses, and a growing collection of grandchildren, and beyond them, Jesse and Silas and Miguel and Rosa and Carlos and Maria and all the people whose lives had been woven into the fabric of the Double W over decades of shared work and shared meals and shared love. The words Kaya had written were these: "I was a girl who climbed into a stranger's wagon carrying nothing but fear and a bone pendant my father had carved. I found 3 mountain men who taught me that strength is not about fighting alone. It is about choosing who to fight beside. And I found one man who looked at me and did not see a stowaway or a savage or a burden. He saw home. He smiled at me that first night, a quiet smile that held no pity and no expectation and no judgment, and everything changed. Everything." The ranch passed to James, and from James to his children, and the house remained what Kaya had always insisted it should be: a place of welcome and warmth and open doors. The story of the 3 mountain men and the Apache girl who emerged from the darkness of a cargo bed into the light of a life she had never imagined became a family legend, told and retold on summer evenings on the porch under the same sky that Caleb and Kaya had watched together, in a voice that always began the same way. The wagon wheel hit a rut in the trail, and something shifted in the cargo bed that did not sound like cattle feed.